This is Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey, hey.
Hello.
Good evening. Today we are continuing our discussion of Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. This is the first book in our series, Alternate History, Alternate Realities. If you're joining us for the first time, we are also on Reddit and on social media at Canonical Pod. Next week, we will have another discussion of this book, so we hope you'll join us for that one too.
For me, I think the easiest way of understanding the structure of the novel is a dichotomy, two sides of one thing. I think that's the organizing principle of the novel, and it's clear that some sort of balance between two things is intended. I think that's what Saunders has in mind. And some sort of synthesis is supposed to come from these two things being juxtaposed against each other. The clearest example I see in the novel is the way the Bardo sections of the novel play against the quote unquote historical documentation sections of the novel. Do you think that this juxtaposition adds up to something? Do they build towards something even bigger than the two of them?
I guess the obvious thing would be North versus South, but I'd like a little more explanation because I didn't really think about this as a book about duality. So I'm curious about that.
Not the content of the novel, but why is it built from these two pieces? I guess that's my real question.
I suppose there is this sense of the truth of a matter, by which I mean the recorded history versus the internal pains or emotions of an event. Those are two very different things. And I think we get to explore that in this book. There's a difference between what history has recorded and how other people think about an event or about another person, and what that person thinks about an event. For example, the death of their child.
One of the more interesting aspects of the historical text is there's that one part where they are describing the party, and you can see from the historical text that quite a few people described it as being a full moon, I think. But there are a few people who, or at least one person who said it was a cloudy night. I think that's interesting because it kind of points toward this idea that even though something is recorded and you probably want to take it as fact, you don't know if you should really trust it as fact. And so it makes you kind of question what is the truth of the matter. I think that's a key question. And he introduces this fairly early on in the book. I think he plants that question in your mind, like, what is the truth of the matter? Should we use historical text to ascertain the truth? And because he juxtaposes this with this kind of oral history, I think it makes me ask myself, well, is this oral history of the Bardo as truthful as the historical text that he's presenting? Because I believe not all of the historical text is actually true. I think he fictionalized some aspect of that as well. So in a way, he's kind of playing games with us, but in another way, I think he is making us think about what is actually true and what we should believe.
Coming at this question maybe from just a craft level, I read an interview with Saunders in Bomb magazine, and he said that he thought that the Bardo sections of the novel were a bit flimsy. If you had just the Bardo sections of the novel, it would be too ethereal. It wouldn't be grounded. And even though, as you know, you're mentioning, James, the historical sections are not truly historical, they have that texture of truthiness. that often serves as a counterbalance to that ethereal nature of a ghost story. So the way he described it is the historical sections are the spine of the ghost story. They give the novel a structure. And to add on to that, I would say that the Bardo sections are the soul of the novel. Both are necessary because I think the soul of the novel is necessary because it elevates the potentially just historical nature of the text to something greater than it would be otherwise. In the first episode, I had kind of teased this a little bit, but I think it's worth coming back to now. What genre of text is this novel, really? Is it a historical novel? Is it alternate history?
As we discussed, it's not alternate history because the events that take place, let's say off page, still happen. What we're dealing with is causality, I suppose. There's kind of a question of how Lincoln came to his decisions, his actions, that the events of this book may have led directly to Emancipation Proclamation. But yeah, as far as what kind of novel this is, I guess it's historical fiction. That's as close as I can come to it, maybe.
I think it is historical fiction, but in the very broadest understanding of the genre.
I would say, though, that the two parts of the novel, the historical text and the Bardo content, prevent it from fully being part of either genre. So the Bardo content prevents it from being alternate history because it's dealing with something that is not contrary to any historical record. It's moving forward in a space where there is no knowledge. It's not saying what you know is wrong and this actually happened. It's saying you don't know this, but I'm proposing that this is the case. So that to me is a different kind of proposition. It definitely also can't be historical fiction because the thing that makes it, to my mind, worthwhile, the thing that adds the soul of the novel, is supernatural. It's something that could never be part of the historical record, anyways. It cannot fit comfortably in either genre, but in that sense, it has to either sit on its own somewhere weird or it has to establish its own new genre. This, I think, it's similar to the tension that I saw between the philosophical novel and the historical novel when we read Paradise by Abdul Razak Gurna, where I thought that the philosophical novel was pushing against the confines of the historical novel in the same way. These things don't naturally go together, and when you push them together, it can work, but it stretches outside of the boundaries.
If you had to give this genre a name, then what would you even call it?
That's difficult because I don't know if it being historical is really significant. I think to me, in my reading, it's much more significant that the metaphysical aspects or supernatural aspects have guided human beings. And that kind of content could be in a story set in present day. So I would almost call it metaphysical speculative. Like it's speculating that these are the metaphysical causes for the events of our world. That to me, I think, is what I take from it. But I think it's very likely that other people might take something different.
If I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that the genre is important because it helps you define what the book is about. Is that right? Genre in and of itself is not important, but in this case, it's important because you're using it to define what the book is actually about.
This is a can of worms that I don't know why worms are often in cans, but we talked about this before when we were doing the Afrofuturism series and whether or not genre matters. And I still hold that genre does matter in the sense that it creates a vocabulary for talking about texts. And with this novel, I do think that the genre matters just so we can understand how this novel is different from other novels that we might be inclined to group it with. Because I think a lot of people who would read this who are interested in Abraham Lincoln would miss the point because it isn't really about Lincoln. I don't think people who love history would necessarily love this novel.
So, in other words, the presence of Lincoln and the backdrop of the Civil War, that's more just flavor for the book.
I think it adds something, but I don't think it's the main ingredient. I think that if I had to say who I would want to sell this novel to, it wouldn't be people who care about Lincoln. It would probably be people who care about maybe Buddhism, people who care about spiritual matters. Those are the people who I think would have a more substantial connection to this novel because it's not really, to my mind, important that Lincoln is involved.
I think that what's more important than Lincoln is the question of the issues of that time, and specifically having to do with race. Because I think one of the images that stuck with me is that very angry slave or former slave. And the last thing you get from the book is he's fighting the racist soldier. And they continue to fight, and they're in this loop where they will continue to fight, kind of, you get the feeling, for eternity. And when I read that section, I thought, well, this is commentary about modern life, but
Yes.
it's also about history. It's a very easy symbol of how these tensions of race have continued in our country. In that way, I'd say that yes, it's not really only about that time, but historical novels are rarely only about that period of history. Because really, a historical novel operates on multiple levels, right? It operates on the importance of that event in history, but also on how that possibly affects our life today. Like, there's always a bridge between the period of history being examined and our life today. So, that presence, I think, makes it kind of important in a lot of ways, in that it's not only about the Bardo and it's not only about Buddhism, it's also about race relations. It's also about people dying in a war and the difficult choices that people have to make because of these issues that surround us in this country. So that would be, I guess, my argument for it not being solely ahistorical, because it is very much anchored in that, even though you could read it as just flavor.
I think that this conversation we're having to me is worth continuing because I do think that the novel is pulling us in several directions, and it's tough to know which directions are more valuable or more significant or more important. In my mind, Lincoln himself is the bridge between those worlds of the novel, the historical world and the Bardo world. He has the agency to create change in both the Bardo and the living worlds. And from a storytelling perspective, I think that Saunders is showing the synthesis between those two worlds. There are things that can only happen in the Bardo because of what happens in the living world, and things that it seems can only happen in the living world because of what happens in the Bardo. So they depend on each other in a certain way. We see this, first of all, because Lincoln's presence in the Bardo allows all of the spirits to finally accept that they are dead and exit the Bardo and potentially be reincarnated, although that's not entirely certain. And Lincoln's visit to the Bardo and the spirit who comes with him when he leaves potentially also gives him the motivation to do the things that we know from history that the real Lincoln did after December 1962. So, from your perspective as readers, which of these is more impactful? Which of these do you think is the more important part of the story?
This is the thing that bothered me the most about this book. We'll be talking about this in the future more, but I think the impact of the Bardo on our reality, on real history, feels much more important to me, because in the end, we're dealing with things that really happened versus these fictional characters that are interesting, but in the end, they're fictional. So when all these spirits are ascending, great, good for them, but it doesn't feel as important or as, to use your word, impactful as what happens off the page, what we know is about to happen in the next month in the real world.
On that, the spirits ascending, I mean, can't you understand that through the lens of progress? That this book you might view as characters who are stuck and characters who are unable to progress. And, if you also look at race relations and you look at, like you extrapolate that to the country as a whole.
Like an ascension of thought in a way, like moving past this problem of race into a higher consciousness, or?
I mean, yes, it's not like a very clear synthesis because I think, generally, when you deal with like Buddhist ideas, it's not like, it's not like doctrine, but I feel like that's one way of understanding this big movement of the book.
You can kind of abstract it to that point where you can put the two things into one box, but I don't want to abstract the Bardo content to that degree because for me, it's not enough. My interest is not just specifically that they were stuck and now they're not stuck. It's specifically that they were dead and they couldn't accept that they were dead and they couldn't accept that their desires for this world are useless. That to me, I think, is the really important human emotional content. And in order to abstract it to that level where it fits with the other stuff, you have to get rid of that. And that to me is really the important part. To me, I think it's very much a book about the afterlife. It's very much about the relationship between the end of this life and whatever comes next.
Do you feel like that was more important to you than the other half of the book?
For me, yes, because I am interested in spirituality and because, well, I enjoy the story that Saunders has told about the emancipation. I don't necessarily confuse that with actual history. Like, I don't think it's important because if this didn't happen the way that Saunders described it, the slaves would not have been emancipated in real life. Their emancipation is, of course, hugely important, but it doesn't create the stakes of the novel that work for me. So I'm like you, I'm of two minds about this. They're both important, but it's tough to see for me if other people would be split in the same way that I think Saunders wants it to be split.
They don't feel equal to me, which I guess is something that, according to that quote you said, it sounds like Saunders feels the same way.
I think the bigger question then is whether or not this is a Christian novel, quote unquote Christian or quote unquote Buddhist. I don't think it's espousing doctrine, but it inhabits one of those thematic points of view. I think the novel flirts with both in terms of its content and its sympathies, but at some point, the Buddhist point of view and the Christian point of view will have to conflict with each other because they do have different points of view. The main thing I see as a problem is if there is a message in the novel about breaking our attachments to the earthly world, how does that message play against the attachment that we see to doing good works and also being judged by those works in this earthly world?
I thought maybe the clearest scene that addressed this was the one where the Reverend went to be judged. And because he was so afraid of going to hell, I think it's pretty clear that, he was going to hell, right? So instead, he decided not to be judged and ran back and continued to be a spirit. So it seems like it's almost in opposition. Like, because this judgment existed, he was unable to move on due to fear. And so he clung closer to the world, but he didn't cling on to it for the same reason as other people. And that's where it gets kind of wrinkly, gets kind of complicated. Because the other people, they still have unfinished business. Like Volman is waiting for his wife, and Bevins needs to come to terms with his homosexuality or whatever. Whereas with the Reverend, you don't really know why he's still there. I guess you could say that he's trying to do good, but for that, you're really extrapolating. I mean, what I took from it is he's still there because he's too afraid to move on. So it's not like he's still attached, he's just afraid of the next step.
When we see these people in the Bardo, we see them encountering hallucinations or apparitions that are trying to deceive them. What I am hung up on, though, is this scene that you're describing, because I remember that as well. He sees two men standing in a line before them, and one man goes to heaven and the other to hell. Was that scene that he saw something real, or was it an apparition?
Yeah, that's interesting because I always read it as real. I did not think of it as being a hallucination.
I did as well, but if it's real, then I think what Saunders is showing us is that there is a real way in which we are judged according to our actions on earth, and there is a non-Buddhist afterlife available to people. And that seems to me something that perhaps would conflict a Buddhist reader. And different from you, when he ran away, I wasn't sure that he was going to be damned, but rather the stress of the judgment itself was too much for him, that he ran away because he couldn't bear even that moment of everything being shown at once. It's possible he would have been damned, but I read him as a very sincerely good person.
I thought before he ran away, one of the judges started throwing up his rainbow vomit.
Yeah, but when the judges were evaluating the other two guys, there was also this kind of performance of like smearing the feces and stuff. Like nobody was ever purely good or purely bad. In either case, whether he's damned or not, I think it establishes kind of a cosmology where what you do on earth matters, and there is a heaven and a hell waiting for you. It seems very contradictory to the rest of the novel. And I think that a novel needs to balance itself. Like, we don't want a novel that tells us exactly how the world of the novel works and lets us predict how everything can work out in unforeseen situations. But we don't want to see the contradictions. And for me, this was a problem because I saw the contradictions. Even if the contradictions happen off of the page, as it were, I see these two things that Saunders is putting forth, and they don't really work well together.
I didn't see this as important at all, but I wasn't thinking about possible contradictions off the page. I was accepting this as a world unto itself. I mean, it's a work of fiction. This is the way he's presenting this world. I don't want to be down on religion or anything, but who's to say that this is not the way things are versus one aspect of Christianity or one aspect of Buddhism?
Harkening back actually to our discussion last week, that scene reminded me of vintage short story Saunders because it is kind of absurd. You actually have the guy in the middle who's seated and he's a judge. What does he say? Something like, don't worry or something. But while that's happening, like something crazy is happening in the background, like the doors open and someone's getting flayed or whatever. And then there's like technicolor vomit, and one guy spawns four midgets or something, four smaller versions of himself. That's the kind of absurdist Saunders that I was expecting. And in terms of something not fitting with the book, I thought it didn't fit because of that. I was just like, oh, he just couldn't resist including this story about the Reverend being judged. So I kind of agree with you in that I didn't think it really fit, but for me, it stuck out for other reasons. I thought it was quite different tonally.
I mean, the first question that I asked there was if it's a Christian novel or a Buddhist novel. But the other way of looking at it, I guess, is what if it's neither? Because, as I mentioned last episode, Saunders himself now is a practicing Buddhist, but as a child, he was raised Catholic. So he inhabits both of these traditions. And in this novel, I don't think that Saunders is sincerely proposing or advocating for either of them. He's not saying that it's in truth actual that ghosts have an influence on the living world. And he doesn't write from any specific kind of theological perspective about the rules of the Bardo that he describes. He, I think, is much more concerned with these things not as they exist in our world, these ideas in our world, but rather as they exist as parts of a story. He is concerned with storytelling. That to me, I think, is fair enough. He is a storyteller first and foremost. He's not a priest. But I feel like there is something that is missing from that perspective. And you might call it sincerity. Now, in Saunders's short fiction, I think the thing that had always felt like was missing was that he was very attached to ironic humor, and it was funny, and being funny was important to him more than other things. And in this novel, I think he goes for something more than that. And Colson Whitehead, in his review of the novel, he mentioned how humane it is. I think that works because it's messy and it's incomplete in the same way that human beings are messy and incomplete. But if I could feel that Saunders had a sincere connection to any of these perspectives, I think it would have been just that little bit stronger than it is now. But I don't know if that's really a fair comment for me to make because it's going beyond what you might call his station as a storyteller. We're asking for something that's really not the storyteller's role to provide us.
Maybe, but I actually don't think you're off base here. I totally agree about his short fiction that is what's missing from it. And I think you're right here. He's very clearly trying something new. He's trying to make this more, I mean, humane is the word I'm looking for, but more meaningful in general. But it's still kind of halfway there. I do feel like I don't want to put too much on Saunders that doesn't belong, especially since this is such a departure already. But maybe that's why, for me, it's kind of in this in between land.
I mean, in that same interview in Bomb Magazine, he was talking about how he was writing this novel and the rules of the Bardo came to him as he was writing. So he would think about it and then he would say, oh, well, this is how it should work. And then he would go back and revise. And of course, that's what writers do. But what it shows me is this is something that he created to tell a story rather than something that he believed. It seems naive to expect that he would have actually believed it, but I think it matters to me. Like, he's presenting something about the afterlife, something that is very important to people. I don't need him to convince me, but if I saw that he himself was convinced, I would feel a little bit better about it.
It's funny because I don't think you're wrong about the sincerity. And yet, that is not what I go to Saunders for. And that is not how I approach this novel at all. I am curious about what a sincere Saunders work looks like. And yet, that is just not very important to me. I think there are real emotions that I can get from his work, even without that extra dose of sincerity.
I mean, you say that you wouldn't go to Saunders for that, but when you say that, are you talking about 21-year-old Sam seeing Saunders for the first time, or are you talking about what we might call Saunders 2.0? Because he has reinvented himself. He is doing something different with his work. Don't you think that sincerity is what is called for in a novel with these kinds of themes and these kinds of stakes?
Well, like I said, I don't think you're wrong. I am curious about what that looks like. I don't think he's incapable of it. I just don't know what it looks like. It's not even 21-year-old Sam looking back and wanting more of that ironic humor. I didn't even know this Saunders existed. To go beyond that and expect a Saunders that is, let's say, I'm trying to think of a work that we've read that would be wholly sincere.
Octavia Butler.
Sure.
Butler has a very coherent worldview about what was that, empathy or something.
Okay, yeah, there's a through line there. Yeah, I don't see Saunders writing a novel like that. I would be curious about it, but I wouldn't expect that of him.
He's too postmodern to present that kind of coherence, I think, because he'd be making a positive statement about something that's so inherently unknowable. Like, I feel like it would be counter to a very basic worldview of a postmodern writer that he is. I mean, I'm sure there are postmodern writers who would write, I guess, a more religious text.
Like when you talk about him being a storyteller first, that is what I'm interested in. I'm interested in him creating a world. I'm not necessarily looking for his take on an abject truth of this world. There might be a metaphor in there for our world, but I'm more interested in the metaphor than I am in truth.
We talked a little bit about this in the last episode, how Nick Offerman, famous TV libertarian, is a friend of Saunders and actually was one of the voice actors, the audiobook version of this novel. He and his wife have purchased the film rights to this novel and plan potentially to make a film adaptation. But one half of the novel, I think, would have to be cut away for that to work. The historical content, I think, is so textual that it could not work in a film adaptation, and it would need to be cut out in order for it to be filmable. Do you think that cut would be acceptable?
I don't think you would necessarily have to cut it out. I can see ways to make that work. It might not work as well as it does textually, but I mean, I think that's true of most books.
Here, I'm not talking about a practical point of view, but rather an artistic point of view. Would it accomplish the same things artistically that these historical texts accomplish in this novel?
I don't know that it would carry the same weight or emotion exactly, but I think maybe you would still get a similar tone.
Like, would you see the quotes on screen as
No.
title cards?
I mean, now you're getting into the practical, but I could see it as having just a camera directly on the face of a partygoer or, whoever character that is, and they just say the line and then it cuts to the next person.
That's how I envision it too, because that's the whole point. It's evidence. It's people who actually lived at that time. So you would have people who are actually living at the time saying whatever they need to say. So, like, for example, when you have conflicting statements, you could even have multiple people, let's say at a party or whatever, say, like, there was a full moon out. And then someone's like, no, you're wrong. It was totally cloudy.
One of my favorite moments, the part that I mentioned in the previous episode that made me laugh, was when all the different people are describing Lincoln and how some people call him ugly and some people call him exceedingly handsome. And they're going through all these different opinions of just the way he presents himself. I think that would be very easy to do. Again, it might not come across as well as it does in text, but I think you could do it.
To achieve that emotional impact of juxtaposition, you could have a voiceover. You could have people say that while you show him carrying his son to like the crypt or whatever, and people are saying, like he did not care for his son at the party or whatever. There are ways you could do it.
I think the difference between you two and me is like this. To my mind, this novel belongs as much to being text as Pale Fire does. And I would never try to adapt Pale Fire into a film because I think that the reason why it works is because it's text. And I think it's the same here.
I think it's more so with Pale Fire, but sure. I will agree with what you said in the previous episode that I think making this into a film is not a great idea. However, I think it can be done. Can it be done well is a different question, though.
And can you trust Nick Offerman to do it well? All right, we'll stop here. Thank you for listening. If you would like to talk to us about Lincoln in the Bardo, we are on Reddit and on social media at Canonical Pod. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back with another discussion of this novel. Till then, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.